open your Bibles to Romans chapter 10. I have been listening to old videos of mine from maybe 14 years ago that we made, and little funny videos we made, things with me on Facebook. The boys have been playing it, and so I have realized that since yesterday, all of those videos we played, that my southern accent is creeping back in. And I found myself just saying, come on, y'all, and just really weird things. But if I were to play a video, and maybe I'll do it next week, of a couple of videos of me when I was in my, 29, you would laugh. You would not believe what I sounded like. I was very southern, folks. It was interesting. So it was not last year. It was over a decade ago. But I sound totally different. It's very strange for me to hear myself. I'm like, I sounded like that? That's strange. But anyway, so if I sound country, southern today, it's my kid's fault. You can blame Landon for playing videos over and over again and laughing hysterically in the kitchen at my accent. So Romans 10, I'm really excited about today. There's actually a link between the last paragraph of chapter 9 and the first paragraph of chapter 10. We are actually dealing with the first paragraph of chapter 10. I'm only going to be able to talk about probably the first two verses of the 4 verses that I was assigned to do today. I assigned myself. But I'm sure you're capable of going and doing some greater study on the following 2 verses. I'll get you started today, and then I'll leave you off, and then you can go maybe do some journaling on your own, some research on your own. It's important to note here before I read this, though, how the gospel affects not only Paul's view for the lost, but then the way that we see lost people. Right view of the gospel affects what you feel about lost people. If you view the gospel improperly or you have a wrong view of the gospel, sinners are a nuisance to you. Our heart does not, there are a lot of, we forget, in the church we'll say things like, oh, how quickly you forget where you came from. I don't think you ever forget where you came from if you have a proper view of the gospel. It is only the wrong view of the gospel that develops the kind of attitude that makes you feel ill towards a brother. You don't forget where you came from when you truly realize the gospel shows you who you are, and you never forget that. It is a constant reminder of who you are, who you were, what sin did. You never get too highfalutin when you have a proper view of the gospel. You don't get judgy towards the lost when you have a proper view of the gospel, because if not for God, you would be just as lost. And so the attitude we see in the church towards lost people come from people who have a wrong view of the gospel. That doesn't come from people who have the right view of the gospel. So what we see here then, we see a man, an apostle, we see Paul, who has the right view of the gospel, and no matter how long, how close to Christ he is, how chosen by God he is, how used by God he is, how effective for ministry he is, how long he's been in the church, none of that affects his heart for the lost. Because he has a right view of the gospel. And he works extensively to give us this view. It is paramount then that we get the right view, because we have been commissioned to go into the world and proclaim this gospel to the lost. And if you have a wrong heart for the lost, you won't go to them. Now, some of you have been praying for your family for years, but you don't go to them with the gospel. Why? Oh, you break bread with them. You share in holiday festivities with them. You go on trips with them. When was the last time you told them the gospel? Do you know that you have family members who are in flames, dying an eternal death, and you're breaking bread with them? What man, what sane man or woman would try to serve dinner to a family engulfed in flames? What sane man or woman would try to have fun and play games when people are engulfed in flames? It's insanity to behave this way. Yet an improper view of the gospel permits us to play games when people are dying in flames. It's a problem. And we see here then an example by Paul. Okay, I got to sit down. All right. We see here then an example by Paul and heart for the lost. And he is compelled to preach the good news to those who are lost. Paul's still speaking about Israel here, and I think that's important. And he's speaking about the Jews here, and I think that is important because when we think of lost people, we think of depraved derelicts out there, right? That's what we say. We don't think of religious people in the church who you would actually qualify and appoint as elders. That's good stuff, man. And I think having the right perspective of who Paul's talking about is important because many of the people that you're going to associate with his passion to see lost people saved are people out in the world acting a fool, but we're not considering the people in the church that we would elect as elder because they live righteous and holy lives. Holy lives, righteous lives. Are you with me? Moral people. People that you would say are saved, Paul says are not. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. So Romans 10 then, he begins to share his heart for the lost because he has a proper view of the gospel. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them, the Jews, is that they may be saved. Now, just so you know, Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, but he has a heart for the Jews. Isn't that interesting? Notice here that God never reprimands him for having a heart for his people. But God did not call him to minister to his people. God called him to minister to the Gentiles. Now, it is important for us to understand that the shame does not come on him for caring about his people. Matter of fact, we should care about our people. And in an environment, particularly in our world, and I understand we're predominantly Caucasian in Pleasant Hill. I understand that. But we live in a world now where it is not okay to care about your people. Not just ethnically, relationally. It's not okay. To care about your people is to not care about others. Are you with me? And we see here then that it's not bad to care about your people. Your people might be white. It's okay to care about your people. Your people might be Jewish. It's okay to care about your people. Your people might be black. It's okay to care about your people. Are you with me today? That's not bad. He's not reprimanded for this. That's okay. But God called him to the Gentiles. You know why? Because when you become a Christian, that's your people too. Right? He's the God to the Jews and to the Gentiles. So in other words, Christianity supersedes your people. Now, and I think this is important, particularly in light of our culture and what's going on. There is two dueling things, dueling desires in the heart of Paul. He has a desire for lost to be saved, and sometimes that's Gentiles. And he has a desire for his people. And both desires they exist cohesively, and one does not snuff out the other. As a matter of fact, God is okay with him having two desires regarding these things. So it is possible today to be a Christian and care about your ethnic race. And that's not bad. But when you care about your ethnic race over what God is concerned about, that becomes a problem. All right? That's important. I just want to throw that in there. It's not in my notes. I think it's important, though. It's important. So, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for them, my people, that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have zeal for God. Now, notice there's a bunch of fours here. These fours are compounding statements to deal with the preceding comment. So he says, I care for them, the Israelites, the Jews, that they may be saved. Why do they need to be saved? For I bear witness that they have zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Why does that matter? For being ignorant of righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Why did they not submit to God's righteousness? For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. You'll notice these main phrases are clarifiers whenever you see the word for. He continues to clarify. He says, I care about the lost because, here's why I'm concerned about my people. They're clarifiers. And we could spend probably the next 6 months talking about these clarifiers. I want to start with the first verse. Verse 1. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. This is what the gospel does. This is what the gospel produces in the heart of someone who rightfully understands it. If you don't understand the gospel, it transforms. If you understand the gospel properly, it transforms your view of people's condition. And it will bring about a passionate desire in you for their salvation. It will not, I repeat, a right view of the gospel will not make you arrogant and condescending towards those who are not saved. It will not do that. A right view of the gospel will not make you judgy towards lost people. It will not. Here's what we see in verse 1. Paul loves his kinsmen according to the flesh. And I'm going to repeat this. That's okay. There is this push today in our culture. I'm going to stay here a little bit longer, and then I'll move off of it. There's a push here today in this culture that we should see everyone the same way. Well, that is not present here. Paul loves his kinsmen according to the flesh, and that's okay. And no matter what the world says about making you want to and pushing you to see everyone the same way, you just don't. Can we just be honest about it? You just don't see everyone the same way. If we're honest. And to say you do is a lie. There are some people with whom you have greater affinity. That's a fact. That's just a fact. And that's okay. Paul did. And guess what? It's okay. God has made you a part of a people group. And I would hope that you would have an affinity for the people you come from. That's okay. That's not dirty, no matter what our world says. That's okay. Now, this will blow your mind, but Paul belongs to a people group. He has an affinity for that people group. Now, is his understanding of himself as a Christian more important than that? Yes, it is. However, he does not and will not ever forget where he came from. And he has a passionate desire for those people, the people he came from, to be saved. Now, you can work this all the way down, because we talk culturally, we talk ethnically. We can work this all the way down to our family. You should have an affinity for those members of your family who are not saved, more than other members of other families. Are you with me? Well, we're all the family of God. Yes, but you have an affinity for your family. That's important. And guess what? That's not bad. You know what it is? It's a license to preach the gospel to those which you have an affinity for. It is a calling, if you will. The affinity placed in you for those you come from is a calling to go to those people. Some of you want to go across the world before you've even gone across the street to preach the good news to your family. Are you with me today? Some of us, as I said last week, have opted to let our feet do the talking, and that has its place. But we haven't ever let our mouth do the talking. We were told to go preach the good news, not go walk it. Is walking it out part of it? Absolutely it is. Producing fruit is evidence that something is happening, but it is not a substitute to the great commandment. If you're walking it but not talking it, you're failing those and you're letting your family burn in flames to death because they're saved by the preaching of the gospel. Are you with me today? Are you guys awake today? This is important. This is important. Now, sometimes it's not a people group. Sometimes it's an affinity towards a certain types of individuals. Some of you, I had a friend I had this kid that came to our youth group. He was a thug. I mean, thug. He was rough. We actually called him, I didn't know his name for the first 6 months I was there. We just called him White Coat John. Well, I guess we did know his name. There were several Johns. We called him White Coat John because I guess we didn't know their last name. We called him White Coat John. He came to church. I remember he came to church because he met this girl that came to our youth group who was they're married now, who was in school, and he came to church to try to hook up with this girl. That's the only reason he was there. And he would make friends with people, take them back behind the shed at the church, and they would smoke pot together. He was corrupting all of my saved kids. Ain't none of them were saved. You know what I mean? They're all smoking pot behind the shed. I'll remember, I thought I was the best youth pastor in the world, just for kicks, so I could just tell you a story. And I thought, what am I going to do to get on to this kid? Because his parents aren't here. He don't care. His parents don't care. What in the world am I going to do to correct this kid? So I couldn't go buy pot. That'd be weird, right? But I went and got some cigarettes, right? And I put these cigarettes in some scriptures, in marked scriptures underline them with cigarettes. And he came in, each of the kids came in. They didn't know I knew what was going on. And there was one kid who was back smoking pot, whose dad was a worship pastor. And I started with him, and he came in and saw the cigarettes in there, and he went, uh-oh. Like he knew exactly. I said, that's not pot, but you get the point. And I said, I want you to read these scriptures. And he read the scriptures. I thought I was so witty. And I remember John coming in, White Coat John, that is. I remember him coming in and just kind of laughing and reading the scriptures and rolling his eyes and whatever. And he was in a gang. He was in a gang and had been a part of drive-by shootings. He was a thug. It was the craziest thing. I won't tell you the whole story. Let me just tell you this. He has an affinity for people locked up in these movements. You know why? Because he was a benefactor of that movement for years. No amount of time of him being a pastor now, because he got saved, he's a pastor now, and no amount of time of being a pastor has he become so polished that he no longer has an affinity for those who long for community so much they will do stuff like join a gang. He has a heart for them. That's never changed. You know why? Because he has not forgot where he came from. Oh, how quickly, when we have an improper view of the gospel, how quickly we forget where we came from. When you think you saved you, you start to have an arrogance and condescendent attitude towards people who are lost because you think it's about you. You were saved and yanked up out of there. And it makes your heart, when you realize that, makes your heart pray for others to be saved like you were yanked out. And you have an affinity for those types of people. What types of people do you have an affinity for? It could be that God has given you that affinity that you might go preach the gospel to them. Oh, and some of you are thinking, well, then why did God make him an apostle to the Gentiles? Oh, I'm coming at you. Listen, he took his Sabbath day and he worked with the Jews. He did not neglect his affinity. Well, I'm getting it out of order here, but just stay with me. There are some people who have committed their entire lives to ministering to particular people groups. Nobody has an affinity for homeless people like homeless people who used to be homeless people. And instead of having people who used to be homeless asking and pushing the pastor to try to do a ministry in the church for homeless people, why don't you take that affinity and create a ministry to go help homeless people? Are you with me? The affinity is the call. And there are people who've committed their whole lives to that. God did uniquely in them to create a yearning and passionate desire for salvation of those people. However, Paul has a passionate desire and yearning for the Jews, and he's apostle to the Gentiles. Why? Because that passionate yearning and desire must never be allowed to override the mission of God. And there are some of us that affinity affects the presentation of the gospel. Come on now. Come on now. We see, however, that although he is the apostle to the Gentiles, in Acts 17, and you go do homework, and in Acts 18, as a pattern for his ministry, we see something interesting. We see him ministering daily to the Gentiles, but then on the Sabbath, we see Paul going to the synagogue to reason, it says, with the Jews. Why? God has called him to the Gentiles, but he loves the Jews, and he isn't going to give up on the Jews. Some of you have given up on your family, regardless of your affinity for them. And it's not okay. Well, it's just too hard. Well, I'm just rejected. Go whine about that to Jesus a little bit and see how that hits him. Why does he continue? God has called him the Gentiles, but he loves the Jews. He's not giving up. He doesn't forget those he had a unique link to. And yet that unique link does not override the mission and call of God on his life. Listen to the way that Calvin says it. I love this, right? Their salvation was an object of concern for him, Paul, before the Lord. And such a feeling arises only from genuine love. In other words, when you love someone, you desire for them to be saved. Now, people will say things like this. You Christians don't love us because you won't accept us like we are. I've heard it. However, the gospel doesn't allow you to think like that. A proper view of it, anyway. It is the exact opposite of love to not take the gospel to those who are where you were. Love makes us look back and say, I'm not satisfied with you staying where you are. What are your feelings towards your family? It concerns me that some of us have become callous towards our families to the degree that we refuse to preach the gospel to them. The gospel does not allow us to wipe our hands of our family and say, somebody else's problem. The gospel, the right view of it, does not allow us to say, I'm moving on because I'm a Christian now. I'm a part of the family of God. You may not be a part of that world any longer, but you can remember it. And if you can remember it, can you honestly say to me that you're satisfied leaving people in that world without falling on your face, begging God to save them from the same place you used to be? And this is where Paul is at. He used to be exactly where they are. The gospel doesn't allow you to forget where you came from. That doesn't mean you continue to partake in sin to win some. I would say partaking in sin is the antithesis of winning some. Listen to what Paul felt when he came to Athens and saw them and their worship for idols. Listen to this. 2 Peter 2:8. Here's what Paul says. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. It tormented him to see people living like he used to live. Some of you have created provisional statements, provisional theologies, provisional philosophies, provisional moral positions based on what you want because you've forgotten where you came from. I will say this regarding parents. The gospel moves a parent's heart from desiring our children to be happy to desiring them to be holy. That them being holy is prioritized over them being happy. And out of the overflow of that is birthed our encouragement to them, our rules for them, our correction to them. You can diagnose real quick whether you want your kid to be happy or whether you want them to be holy by what you encourage them to choose, the things of the world or the things of God. The provision you create for them when they are given and faced with the choice to choose the world or choose God, you encourage them and create provisions for them to choose the world because God loves them anyway. When you do that, you don't love your children. You love them to hell. Shawn, why are you being so bold and brass about this? I'm going to offend some people, and some people are going to think I'm talking about them, but I'm talking about all of us. I'm talking about me. Because as a parent, every single one of us in this room struggle with this. And we are all guilty. Some of you are like, I'm going to say it. Some of you, this hits everyone, including me. My kids are older now, so I don't have to worry about this, but I did have to worry about this, and I did not make good choices regarding this. You with me? Try not to freak out on me here. But it's important we talk about the issues of the day. What would the apostles say as they sat in our stadiums? And what would they say about our worship? Is it bad to like football? No. No, it's not bad to like football. It might be bad to like football as much as we do in comparison to how much we like God. That might be a problem. We tell jokes. I have pastors that tell jokes about, well, it's football season. We're going to be down 50% in attendance. And they think it's funny. I don't think it's funny at all. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Well, we want people to be happy. No, we want them to be holy. Parents will spend thousands upon thousands of dollars to pay for trainers because they know that time and energy and training and teaching and learning and education is requisite to be good and to learn and to be excellent at anything. But we will encourage kids when they're faced with a choice to choose church or choose training for football or baseball or basketball or soccer or band or dance. We will pay because we know it's important that the hours that they put in, develop them in that area. We will choose that and the hours they spend there because it's valuable over attending church. In other words, we're saying the hours you put into this is more important than the hours you put into church. In other words, we have an attitude that the time at church does not develop a child in the ways of God as much as going to a practice develops a child in the way of a sport. Oh, no amens. I didn't think so. But it's the truth. Now, some of you are like, well, of course you say that, Shawn. You're a pastor. I'm a dad, too. I'm a dad, too. And the world has, do you know, they used to never have practice on Wednesday night for sports. You know why? Because the church didn't choose sports over God. You know what? They used not to have games on Sunday back in the day. You know why? Because people didn't choose football over God. Now the world has put the top 2 days for sports on the 2 days church happens. You know why? Because Satan wants your child to choose football, baseball, basketball, soccer, dance over God. And as parents, let me ask you a question. Would you rather them be happy or be holy? Right? It's choice. It's not only choice for the parents, it's a choice for the kids. Shawn, don't try to encourage my kid. They got a college scholarship I'm working for. And guess what? Guess what will happen with that college scholarship? It will turn to ash like everything else. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm crazy. But it is a little wild that we're more interested in our kids spending time to develop the flesh, and we forego them spending time to develop the spiritual side of them. That's insanity to the highest order. To the highest order. It lets us see where our priorities are. The world wants you to choose it over God, and we are. We are. The world puts you in a position to have to choose it over God. Parents, what do you encourage your kids to do when they're put in a position to choose? Well, this is your choice. Is it? Because when it's stuff that's important to you, they don't have a choice. I don't know. When people find out you hold the doctrines of grace and election, they immediately comes this conversation, and I'll say this. Well, what about evangelism? I have heard this thousands of times in the last year and a half. When people hold to strong sovereign election and the doctrines of grace, people will inevitably, people that push back and have a problem with that will say, well, what about evangelism? They say, since you believe in sovereign election of God, you must be incapable of having passion for evangelism and the lost sinners of the world. However, we see in chapter 9, listen to me, we see in chapter 9 that Paul wholeheartedly believes in sovereign election. And then immediately in chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, he begins to be concerned about the salvation of Israel. So it is possible. It is possible to believe in sovereign election and be concerned for the lost. In chapter 11, Paul will actually specifically talk about Israel and the election there, specifically for them. Here in chapter 10, he says, my heart's desire and prayer after believing in sovereign election is that they might be saved. What's the difference in that and believing in God sovereign over my healing and praying? What is the difference in believing in sovereign election, believing God is sovereign in election, and believing God is sovereign over my healing and praying that God would heal me? Well, we believe that healing is a sovereign act, correct? Only God can do that, correct? Only God can do that, correct? Then why pray? Because they'll say, well, if only God saves, and it's God's choice, and He elects, well, then you wouldn't want to pray then, right? If you really believe in sovereign election, you believe this is God's business, then you would never want to pray. But the same people pray for God to heal, and He's sovereign over that. We only have a problem with this when we don't understand prayer. Do we really think that the sovereign God of the universe is looking down and waiting for instructions from us in our prayers before He does anything? That's nonsense. Listen, I heard this analogy. Prayer is the boat that's tied to the dock. You're the boat, in case you're wondering. You're not the dock. You're not the dock. It isn't like you're the dock that's constantly pulling God to bring Him close to you. God is the dock, and prayer allows God to pull your heart closer to Him. And it's constantly doing that. This is why it says pray every day, constantly. Be constantly in prayer. Why? That we may be pulled in and stay close to the heart of God. The proper understanding of election ought to increase your heart for the lost because you realize you did nothing yourself to save yourself. A better point is this. Why pray at all for people's salvation if you don't believe in election? Why even pray? If you don't believe in sovereign election, why pray? Why aren't you preaching to your family to convince them to change their mind? Since it depends on you and it depends on them. Why are you not every day you get together and break bread and play games and hang out and go to Thanksgiving and be at Christmas? Why are you not in every conversation trying to convince them? What does prayer have to do with it? If He's not sovereign. That's good. Shawn, that's really good. Thank you. We go to prayer because we know He is the boss. That's why we pray. That's why we pray constantly. That's why we pray all the time. Because we know this is God's business. If it depends on people choosing, what are you doing to convince them? Why are you not praying? Why are you praying when you could be convincing? Do you see the confusing belief system that shapes our actions today? When you have an improper view of the gospel, this is why we have so many seminars on prayer, because we don't even understand the gospel. We need to stop talking about prayer, and we need to start preaching the gospel, because if we get a right view of the gospel, prayer's easy. Prayer's easy. The right view of the gospel makes all the dominoes fall. And we're having conferences for things to try to bring an understanding that's been so confused and so darkened by an improper proclamation and view of the gospel. It's crazy. An important point of clarification, Paul's not praying for the salvation of sinners or who we would classify as sinners today. He's praying for those who we would appoint as elders. It's bonkers, man. Just to get a perspective of what's going down here and who he's talking about. He is praying for those we in the church would appoint as elders. God is praying for the salvation of people who many of us would classify as Christians and look to as elders because of their lifestyle and how much better their lifestyle and morality was than anyone we know in our life. Look at verse 2. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. God, in other words, God, I want you to save these people because they're zealous for you. It's bonkers. They go to church whenever the doors are open. Would you save them? They take communion every time it's served. Would you save them? They pray daily for hours. Would you save them? They have memorized the first 5 books of the Bible. Would you save them, please? They tithe exorbitantly. Would you save them? Sounds bonkers. But that is precisely what the apostle is saying. Here's it putting himself in light of where he came from. Because that's the second verse. He's thinking of himself and comparing himself and the zeal he used to function in with the zeal they have. Listen to this. Galatians 1, 13 through 14. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently, and I tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my father, and yet he needed to be saved. Paul was willing to murder people for God. When Stephen was stoned, he was there leading the chants to the stoning. That's zeal for God. Sound a little familiar? Kind of like Hamas? Come on, track with me now. Don't let me lose you. That's zealousness for God. Philippians 3 through 6, he begins to show where he came from again. For we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and the glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, I'm blameless. Yet he needed to be saved. Acts 22, 3 through 5. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. And yet Paul needed to be saved. See, the gospel changes your focus. If you don't understand the gospel, all you want is for people to be zealous, not to be saved. Come on now. Come on now. And there is a difference. But when you understand the gospel, zeal in and of itself is just not enough to be saved. One of the most troubling verses in the Bible, Matthew 7, 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, I had a lot of zeal. Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and kill people in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. This verse, the people demonstrated in it, is zeal without knowledge of truth. This is not a secondary issue, folks. The right view of the gospel is primary. This is a primary issue. If we don't get this right, so why, Shawn, man, the sovereignty of God is just, oh man, 3 whole chapters of this, oh my goodness gracious, what are we going, can we just get past this already? How can we ever get past this subject? How? I'll tell you how. I'll tell you why people want. Because we would rather get to zeal. But zeal will never be a substitute for salvation.